So thank you all for being here. I'll introduce myself to any of y'all who don't know me in just a minute, but first, I want to go through a little bit of this. So this is a webinar. We do these pretty frequently, and I do one a month, and it's going to be about an hour long with a Q&A at the end. So a total of about an hour and 15 minutes. Then we'll take a little break and then come back for an after party, which is a social space where y'all can come together, we can come together, and we can keep talking about all the stuff that comes up during our discussion today. So all we ask is that y'all come in with curiosity and an open mind. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. So take what works for you, leave behind what doesn't. And if any of y'all find yourself facing any struggle, any difficult thoughts, or you find yourself needing some support, please feel free to reach out to folks like Trevor Project, Trans Lifeline. You can find the numbers on the screen there. Feel free to jot them down, take a screenshot, whatever helps you feel secure in the space. You can turn on the captions if you want, if that helps. I'm actually going to turn mine on real quick. So let me do that. And we have, gotta go back. We have a chat and we have a Q&A box. So those are going to serve different functions. If you've got questions that you want to make sure get answered during the Q&A, type them in the Q&A box. And that way they live there and I can see them when it comes time to see them. But feel free to interact in the chat with each other. I'll ask you all questions that you can answer in the chat. But I wouldn't put questions for me in the chat because it's going to get buried under the conversation. And then when it comes time for questions, we're not going to be able to find it. So if you do have questions that you want to get addressed, please make sure to put them in the Q&A. Now, also, when you're messaging folks, make sure, sometimes it slips to like a private message. You'll accidentally just be DMing one person when you mean to message the whole group. So do make sure that when you're meaning to message the whole group that it is set to message everyone, because I know that happens with some frequency. Reminder, this will be recorded. In fact, it's being recorded right now. And afterwards, you will get a copy of the recording, you will get the resources, and you will get a post-event survey, which I'll also give you during our time together today in case you just kind of want to get it started, get in, get it over with. And yeah. With that said, we can go ahead and get started. So I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight. This is one of my favorite topics. I'll tell you more about why as we go through. Some of y'all who know me are going to learn a little bit more about me tonight. And those of you who don't know me yet, well, it's a pleasure to meet you. This is called Moving Beyond the Vanilla, subtitled Expanding Sexuality, Intimacy, and Relationships. And it's a webinar that I've been wanting to do with Plume since I've been connected to Plume, which has been a minute. And I'm just so tickled that I finally get the opportunity to talk with you all through this. Right? A little bit about me, right? So my name is Lee. That's how I pronounce it. It is Lee, rhymes with key, K-E-Y, but it's L-E-Y. My pronouns are she or they. She makes me happy and they is okay. What I do during the day is I'm a philosophy instructor at New Mexico State University. I also teach at Doña Ana Community College, taught at universities around the country so far. I'm also the dialectical programming coordinator for a Pennsylvania-based therapy practice called Grow Through Change. I have my own coaching practice called Transcendence Coaching, which is a kink-informed, queer-centered, non-monogamy informed, sex worker positive coaching and consulting practice. And I'm also a peer facilitator and educator here at Plume, where I do the E+ groups, some of them, and also work with the quadragenarian groups. Before all of that, I was the LGBTQI+ curriculum coordinator for the Sexual Health Alliance, which is a group that certifies and educates ex-therapists, sex counselors, educators, intimacy consultants, etc. And I was also the LGBTQI+ programming director for Charlie Health, which is the largest virtual intensive outpatient therapy program in the world. Credential-wise, the ones I'm including here, I got a PhD in philosophy and I'm certified as a sexuality counselor through the Sexual Health Alliance. And then in terms of identity, the perspective that I see all this stuff through, perspectives which inform basically every moment of my existence, I am a trans woman outside of the binary, or I might say a non-binary trans feminine person. I do identify as aromantic and asexual, which is to say that sexual attraction and romantic attraction don't play much of a role in how I understand myself or relate to other people. I am a neurodivergent human being. I am autistic and I do experience ADHD. And more fundamentally than any of those things, I experience all of them through the more sort of fundamental lens of whiteness, which, I'm queer, I'm trans, I'm neurodivergent, but I experience all of those fundamentally through whiteness. So I experience a very white version of transness, a very white version of neurodivergence, etc. And I always think that's important to note because it's going to be a factor one way or another. We can either name it or pretend like it isn't there. And those are the sorts of things where when we pretend like they're not there, they can do a little more damage. So now, if any of y'all have been to my webinars before, you've seen all that stuff. Now I'm going to let you in on some secrets and tell you a little bit more about me, right? So I'm also a professional BDSM educator, right? With my friend Midori, who actually wrote the first English language book on rope bondage, he taught the Sexual Health Alliance's Kink Informed certification program to teach sex therapists, intimacy consultants, etc., more about kink and BDSM. I also am a professional dominatrix and work currently and regularly, not with private clients, though I do work with events. So I'm sort of a dominatrix for hire in various nightlife establishments in and around my little area. And if you don't know what this term means, that's okay. But if you do, now you know, I am a lifestyle switch. So I'm not just a professional BDSM educator and practitioner, but also it informs my personal relationships, my understanding of myself, the world around me, etc., etc. And that's one of the big reasons that I'm really excited to talk with you all about this stuff today, because I don't get an opportunity often, and it's one of my favorite topics. So that's a little bit about me, where I've been, what I've done, what I do, and a little bit more about what I do. With all that out of the way, let's look at the agenda. First, I want to talk about this idea of a whole new world, because whenever I introduce someone to BDSM, I give them a tour of the dungeon for their first time, etc., etc., they always start singing that song. You know that song from Aladdin, A Whole New World? Yeah, it's almost a meme at this point. Happens a lot. I hear it all the time. So we're going to explore that and then dive a little bit into some nerdy stuff about what do we even mean when we talk about kink and BDSM. We'll do a little bit of myth busting, break some of the falsehoods and the misconceptions that people have. Talk about safety and risk awareness, and then conclude with a little bit of inspiration for getting creative. That'll be it for the webinar part. Then we'll hold a little bit of a Q&A and then shift into our social space where we can keep it going for a little bit. So that's the agenda. Let's dive right in. It's kind of funny because Plume has all of these sort of stock slides that we use for our presentations, and there's a limited selection. And when you're doing a webinar on this topic, none of them really fit. So I really had fun going through and figuring out, well, what is the best image for all of these? Do I want these happy smiling people or these other happy smiling people? You'll see what I mean as we go through. But it felt fitting that this would be the image for a whole new world, because for a lot of us, that's an image that represents transition, right? It's an image that represents stepping out of what was pushed onto us and stepping into a more expansive, more authentic version of us, of ourselves, of who we can be, who we want to be, and who we are. In terms of gender, many of us might be used to experiencing this whole new world. And it might be that once we step into womanhood, manhood, a non-binary identity, however we're moving forward, we start to recontextualize it and understand it at a deeper, maybe more flexible, more dynamic level as we walk forward. And the same thing might happen with our sexuality, with our relationships, with our connection to intimacy, where we're born with certain stories told about how it has to be, certain conceptions forced on us about how it works, what it's for. But then we start taking those steps and we realize, oh, there's a whole world out there left to be explored. There's a lot. And a lot of the things that we've been taught about how things had to be were just straight up lies. I know that was my experience, right? In fact, my gender transition and my exploration into professional kink and BDSM are deeply connected, because my local dungeon, back when I lived in North Texas, was the first place that I felt welcome and comfortable presenting in femme mode. It's the first place where I could go and get dressed and feel good and not worry. because I was worried that people were going to judge me. Now, a lot of that was internalized. A lot of that was me worried about my, projecting onto other people, thinking they were watching me everywhere I went. But I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this feeling. But getting into this space, the space where people were a little bit more free to move around, it helped me embrace that same freedom too. Right? So for me, these two journeys are deeply connected. There's a whole new world over here and a whole new world over here, but they're really, really overlapping worlds. But unfortunately, stepping into queerness doesn't always automatically come with any kind of liberation with respect to sexuality, intimacy, or relationships. So here's a long quote by one of my favorite thinkers. If you've been to my webinars before, you know I really like to quote him. This is Devin Price from an article you can find on Substack called The Quietly Coercive Nature of Vanilla Sex. And the quote says, even within queer circles, you can still routinely see people using incredibly narrow and heteronormative definitions of sex that hinge upon penetration and physical presence and assume that orgasms are or should be the end goal for all people. Asexual perspectives, such as my own, are still largely ignored by most sex writers, even though we make up a significant portion of the kinky and, on top of that, sexually active neurodivergent communities, and are constantly contributing novel ways for people to enjoy sex. I love that phrasing there. It doesn't say to have, but to enjoy. So Price continues, very little consideration is given to people for whom sex does not involve physical contact, for whom sexual attraction does not involve human bodies whatsoever, and also those with extremely dark, intense, or controversial kinks. And as we'll see, pretty much any kink ends up being controversial. It's kind of built into the notion of kink itself. Now, I wanted to highlight this quote at the beginning because we might think that just by stepping into queerness, suddenly we have that whole new world ahead of us. And in a sense, we do, but as Devin Price points out, even within queer circles, you often see this insistence on this very narrow and very heteronormative definition of sex. It can take a lot of work and a lot of deconstruction for us to move past that if we choose to, if we want to. So, what is sex anyway? I used to think it was an easy answer, right? Because I grew up being told I was like a straight boy, right? And through a restrictive cis heteronormative lens, sex is a pretty straightforward concept. You take the thing, you put it in the other thing, you move it in and out a little bit, boom, you're having sex. But it turns out that once you step out into the real world, which is not the cis heteronormative world, right? It's the world that acknowledges gender and sexual diversity and diversity of bodies and preferences. Once you step out into that real world, the question of what sex is gets complicated. So what is sex? For that matter, what isn't sex? What could be sex? Is it a physical activity? I don't know. People engage in cyber sex. Is it a state of mind? Is it just like, if you think you're having sex, then you're having sex? What if two parties involved disagree? Is it a type of connection, right? Does that mean that two people can have sex just by like having a staring contest? Maybe sex is just a big confusing mess, or maybe it's a lovely bit of nonsense with no intelligible definition. Right? It's a really tough question. There's this article you might check out at some point by a writer named Greta Christina called Are We Having Sex Now or What? And in that article, Greta Christina points out a very similar thing. When she was younger and having just cisgender, vanilla, straight sex, she could keep track of what the kids today call the body count pretty easily. But once she started expanding her notion, getting into queer spaces, getting into kink spaces, who counts and who doesn't got a lot more complicated, right? So that question might be a little vexed, and we might have very much disagreements about what counts as sex, and our own ideas might not be consistent. But to make it even more complicated, we might ask, what about intimacy too? Sometimes that word intimacy is just used as a euphemism for sex. Like one of my more shy friends might call me up and be like, yeah, I went out with this guy last night and we got intimate. And you know what they're saying, right? But they're using it as a euphemism. But that's just silly, right? Because there can be sex, whatever that is, without intimacy. And there can be intimacy without sex. I have multiple intimate partnerships. None of them are sexual, right? You might have sexual partnerships. None of them are intimate. There's overlap here, but they're not completely overlapping circles. So whatever sex is, we might think intimacy, though, is something like it's a glue that fastens our relationships. Right? It's something that facilitates bonding. And sex is intimate when it does that, and it's not when it doesn't, right? And intimacy can take as many forms as would serve us to explore. Some of the most intimate connections I've had are with my friends who are tattoo artists, where it's truly an intimate experience to be on their table under their needle, or the intimacy of co-writing a poem, the intimacy of going for a walk, the intimacy of caring for a pet, right? These are all intimate activities, not sexual. But we see now this notion of sex, this notion of intimacy, they're complicated. But what about relationships? That's no simpler. Our culture tends to put intimate sexual relationships on a pedestal, have a very narrow notion of what can count as an intimate sexual relationship, put it on a pedestal, and downplay all the rest. You need to find the one who is your best friend, your romantic partner, and your best lover that you will ever have in the rest of your life. But that expectation is silly too. It doesn't serve us. If that's what you want, great. But if you want it because we're told we have to want that, that is a different story. Because what we know is that relationships can take any form that serve the people involved. In a sense, we're in a relationship with everyone we know. And then those relationships can take this shape or that shape. And maybe some shapes impose restrictions. Like, I have this shape of relationship with this person, therefore I'm not going to have that shape of relationship with anyone else. If that's consensual, great, right? But that doesn't mean that those other things aren't relationships in some sense too. We might ask, what would the world be like if we gave ourselves permission to have more kinds of relationships? Maybe we do have a sexual romantic relationship. Maybe we also have deeply, deeply committed friendships. And then maybe we have a play partnership and a creative partnership and people we organize with. And all of these end up being deep relationships without necessarily any of them held up higher than the rest. It's not that they're ranked, they're different. So you can see, once you start to step into this whole new world, the notion of sex, the notion of intimacy, the notion of relationships, they become very complicated, complex. And for some people, that's a turnoff. If you don't like complexity, if you want things cut and dry, but you might be the sort of person who finds this exciting. Because in this whole new world, you can find a good bit of liberation, of grounding, of connection that you might not have thought possible living in the old world, as it were. So I want to throw a question into the chat. I'm just curious, right? Because this whole new world for a lot of people is a new world for a lot of us. Not many of us are born with sort of, or raised in sex-positive, kink-friendly environments, or much less queer-friendly environments. So I'm curious if any of y'all want to share, where did you first learn about sex? About intimacy? About relationships? For me, I first learned about sex from my middle school gym teacher. Not the best source, but that's where I learned it. Oh, television, movies? Oof, okay, there's an answer. Yeah, those of us who learn about it from the media, right? If we learn about it from sort of capitalist-driven, Hollywood or television, then we're learning about it through a very, very specific lens, right? Because we might recognize that those things do not have the best representation, right? We probably saw no one like us in the sex ed that we received, whether it was direct or indirect, right? I see one mention of porn. Yeah, a lot of us learn about sex from porn. Actually, research suggests that that is where the vast majority of young people are learning about sex these days, from pornography, right? And I'm not going to take an anti-porn stance, but it's not exactly, at least the mainstream most accessible porn is not exactly the best source of education, especially when you're coming in from any kind of non-normative identity or preference. Right. I see mentions of misinformed friends. I'm seeing mentions of religious influence here, anatomy-based sex ed books for real vague basics. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people mention about, answer the question about learning about sex. I'm curious, what about relationships? Where did you first learn about those, even if they were just modeled? I think for me, I learned about relationships primarily from watching my parents. I was a sheltered kid. I didn't see a lot of relationships outside of the home. And also by watching like sitcoms. I grew up in like the golden era of sitcoms, so I learned a lot about relationships from watching like Married with Children and Dinosaurs. That show was great. What about you all? Where did you learn about relationships? And while I'm waiting for folks to type, I'll also emphasize in learning about relationships, I learned a very narrow view of what they could be and what they had to be. And there I'm seeing a lot of folks mentioning TV, movies. Yeah. I always think it's good when we carry along these ideas that are a little bit restrictive of what's possible to reflect on where we got them, where they came from, because it can make it a little bit easier to start to tinker with them, deconstruct them when we can trace them back to their root. So I'll move on to the next section. I'll ask another question to y'all once we get through it. But I want to explore more explicitly this idea of kink and BDSM now. And there you can see one of those things I was talking about at the beginning where I had to use the Plume stock images and I didn't know which one to put with which title card. So some of them I think are kind of funny. Like I love these two. They just negotiated a scene that they're going to get into and here they are just high five and ready to go. Yeah. So when I first started exploring kink and BDSM, I had no idea what it was because, I just had stereotypes and not much media representation. And I just thought it was kind of scary and kind of out there. And, it was something that like people in like full body leather and latex suits did. And for some reason, I thought they were all really tall and they just like to like whip each other. Right. I didn't know much about it at all. And I remember when I first went to a dungeon and I first saw with my own eyes, I was amazed. This is not what I thought. The varieties of activities, the varieties of bodies and identities, and also just the fact that a lot of people were just standing around talking to each other, snacking, eating cheese and crackers or cookies off of a cookie tray. Right? It almost felt like I was in something like a gym or like a YMCA, not the sort of crazy, creepy dungeon thing that I thought I was going to. Right? So I learned a lot very, very quickly. And I learned that it's it's not a monolith. Just like being trans is not a monolith, being into kink or BDSM is not a monolith. So my friend Stephanie Gorlick, really amazing kink educator and therapist, has this book called With Sprinkles on Top: Everything Vanilla People and Their Kinky Partners Need to Know to Communicate, Explore, and Connect. Right? And in it, Stephanie writes, this is near the beginning, we often think about BDSM as a single thing, a universe built out of leather, metal, rubber, and rope, inhabited by only two kinds of people: demanding, egotistical sadists and their groveling, pathetic slaves. And yeah, that's kind of the image that I had before I went in. And as you might gather, Stephanie goes on after this passage to say, yeah, but that ain't right. There's so much more to it than that. And that's what we'll do in this next section, too. So I'm going to get a little nerdy with y'all, right? So, what is kink? Here's how I like to think about it. You can use the word differently if you want, but here's how I'm going to use it. I think kink is the interest in and the consensual exploration of what we can call the erotic non-normative. Now, I don't use the word sexual there for reasons I'll get into, but erotic, this sort of embodied, passionate, empowered connection. And it's non-normative, transgressive. It exists outside of norms. It breaks the social rules. So society says this is what you need to be interested in erotically. When you push back against that, when you go outside of that norm, and you're still maintaining consent in your exploration, then you're exploring kink. Right? And what this means is that what counts as kinky can change depending on what dominant culture decides is, quote, normal. Right? And you get some really interesting results here, right? So speaking as a sexologist and educator, one of the things that I think is fascinating is, one of the most common sexual practices that we see today is pegging. You go into any sex toy shop and there will be a wall of harnesses. It's incredibly common, but people treat it like it's abnormal. So even though it's common, it's seen as transgressive because people don't admit that they're into it, right? So it still maintains a status as being a kink. It goes against what dominant culture decides is normal, even though statistically it's pretty much very common, right? But if we think of kink as the consensual exploration of the erotic non-normative, then what is BDSM? Well, a lot of people use these terms, kink and BDSM, interchangeably. I don't, right? They're similar, and I think they're related, but I don't use them interchangeably. Right? So the term BDSM, it's actually not that old. It's only a couple decades old. It's an overlapping acronym. It actually should be BDDSSM. It stands for bondage, or as I wrote there, because the typo, bondage and discipline, domination and submission, sadism and masochism. So bondage and discipline, those are about restriction. Those are about limitation of movement and moving around in not physically confined spaces, but moving around in restricted spaces, whether you are physically constricted or whether or not it is more mental, emotional, right? Domination and submission are about power exchange, right? It's about giving power or being given power. And sadism and masochism historically are tied to feeling excitement or arousal with either giving or receiving pain. Though I follow some others in thinking that pain is the wrong concept here. It's actually something more like intense sensation, right? So the sadist would be someone who enjoys giving someone intense sensation when that someone wants it. And the masochist is someone who enjoys receiving intense sensation, which might be pain, might not be. Right? So that's the origin of the term. And we might think of BDSM, the thing, as this set of emergent subcultures and practices that center around kink. So we've got this consensual exploration of the erotic non-normative, and over time we start to get leather culture, we start to get pup culture, we start to get dungeons, and we start to get educational networks, we start to get groups and families and houses, and all of these things start to build up into these subcultures. Practices get codified. We learn from each other. This is how you throw a flogger. This is how you engage with candles. And these emergent cultures and practices, that's what I'll use the term BDSM to refer to. Now, I know even just talking about kink or BDSM can make some people turn a little red in the face. I've seen it because I've talked about this stuff with a lot of people. And that's because our culture is, on the whole, not that sex positive. Right? But even that term, sex positive, is a little tricky. I want to tell you, too, how I'm going to use it. Sometimes when people hear the word sex positive, they think it's about insisting that everyone has sex all the time. Like someone who's actually sex positive is out having an orgy right now, right? And if they're not really sex positive. But that ain't it. That's a mischaracterization. It's not about insisting that everyone have sex all the time. Instead, it's about insisting on nothing really except for that everyone have the ability to practice sexual agency and to self-determine so as to pursue and attain the sexual practice that best suits them without coercion or shame. Right? That's true sex positivity, is encouraging people to live their own authentic sexual lives, to practice agency and self-determination. For me, that involves nothing that any of my vanilla friends would ever call sex. In that sense, I've been celibate for over half a decade, and I have no intention of going back. I'm asexual. Right? And part of sex positivity is granting me the agency and self-determination to live that way without coercion or shame. At the same time, some of my friends are hooking up with people all the time, but it's uncoerced. It's the result of their agency and self-determination. It's not my practice, but it's theirs. Sex positivity suggests that we celebrate each other, not for what we actually do in our spare time, but for whether or not it's coming from agency and self-determination. Right? It's about freedom and permission. So, with some of this understanding of sex positivity, of kink, of BDSM on here, I want to know if you want to share any in the chat, what negative stereotypes have you been conditioned to associate with kink and BDSM? And also, returning to what I said earlier, where did those come from? Like, I always thought that I was raised to think that people who were into kink were always traumatized, that it there had to be explained through some kind of trauma, right? What about you? Like, any negative stereotypes that you have come to associate with these practices that you'd want to share? Sharing them is not endorsing them. It's more just like we're repeating the stuff we've heard. That they're deviant. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And deviant in a bad sense. Usually that comes out a little bit of spite on the tongue. That doms are just cruel people and subs are weak, traumatized worms. Yeah, most subs in real life. Yeah, fascinating, the psychology of submission, right? Harsher, selfish doms. Been with a few really bad doms. I feel you, my friend. I have as well. A generation of kinky people being groomers as a whole. They're traumatized. I see the effect that 50 Shades of Grey, curse its name, had on the kink community. Gave me a peek. Yep. 50 Shades, I'll talk about that again in a minute, was one of the most dangerous things that happened to the kink community because you ended up getting a lot of people who wanted to be Christian Grey coming in and not knowing what they were doing and thinking it was an opportunity for them to lean into their insecure masculinity by hurting women. And if y'all have spent time in dungeons, you know that's not really how it works. Or if you spend time in kink community, you know that is sometimes how it does work, but it's not how it's supposed to work, right? So the influx of Christian Grey wannabes after 50 Shades was difficult to navigate, to say the least. Yeah, and it's amazing talking again about cultural representation, how that one cultural phenomenon of 50 Shades of Grey could have so much of a negative effect and harm on the subculture for so long, right? Yeah, I see this one, the general idea that an instruction must be followed even before a relationship has been established or really getting to know each other. Oh, friend, I see that absolutely. Someone who walks in and they think because they're a dom, everyone has to listen to them. It's like, honey, you gotta earn submission. That doesn't come for free, right? Yeah, and even if you try to earn it, that's no guarantee that you're gonna get it. Mm-mm, mm-mm. Yeah, so I appreciate you all sharing. I'll have a couple more questions as we go through, but I want to move into myth busting. And with this image, I see these two as just kind of looking skeptically at someone who's saying a bunch of nonsense about kink and BDSM, and they're just patiently waiting it out and being like, oh. So that's how I interpret this picture. So this is from a paper on sex positivity and counseling psychology from an academic journal. Fascinating here. It's a review of a number of different studies, a synthesis, and it says, contrary to the sex negative assumptions that kink identified individuals exhibit pathology, that is some kind of negative mental health pattern. Numerous studies, and they're listed there, have demonstrated that individuals who engage in BDSM report no higher and often lower levels of psychological distress than the general population. That's fascinating. Not higher levels of psychological distress, but often lower levels. And also that they score within normative, and here that just means like statistically normal ranges on personality inventories. They have equivalent attachment style distributions to controls. So someone who is into kink or BDSM is no more likely to be insecurely attached or to have, you know, an avoidant or an anxious attachment style, and also are no more likely to have suffered sexual abuse or coercion. Right? Not to say they haven't, but that it's no more likely within the population of BDSM practitioners than it is in the general population. I love this paragraph because it in itself dispels so many myths. So many myths. And also that line about how those of us who engage in BDSM often report lower levels of psychological distress. There's other research here that I didn't include in the presentation, but that I'll mention, which suggests that people who regularly practice BDSM have higher levels of like default mindfulness. And we might be familiar with the positive effects mindfulness can have on all sorts of aspects of regulating the nervous system, maintaining grounding, releasing stress, increasing focus, etc., etc. So a couple of myths, right? That one that kink stems from trauma. There's just no research that has shown that interest in any particular kink correlates with any particular variety or level of trauma. It's a common stereotype, and this is not to say that no kink ever has a connection to trauma. Certainly sometimes they do. But there's no sort of widespread pattern of correlation where you can say, oh, this person's into age play, they must have experienced this particular kind of trauma. Or this person enjoys needles, they must have trauma that they're working through. The data just isn't there, and we've looked, right? So can we explain interest in kink as just a trauma response? We sure can't. And in fact, doing so perpetuates sex-negative stereotypes, because what it does is it pathologizes it. And insofar as that word trauma literally means wound, it's perpetuating the idea that kinky people are invariably wounded. And, some of us enjoy our wounds, but not in that sense. Right? Second myth, that kink is just abuse. I saw that one mentioned in the chat a few times, and this is where 50 Shades comes into the slides. It's an easy myth to buy into if your only exposure is 50 Shades of Grey. But the difference between kink and abuse is the same as the difference between anything in abuse. It's negotiation and consent. Right? Kinky people are no more likely to be abusive than non-kinky people. Right? And remember, when we defined kink, it's the consensual exploration of the erotic non-normative. Consent is built into it. If it's not consensual, sure, it's abuse. But anything that's not consensual, right? Think about a job. If your job is not negotiated and consensual, that's an exploitative, abusive situation rather than employment, right? So kink's no different there. And the third myth, one that I really, really like to emphasize to folks because it cannot ever be said enough times, kink is not inherently sexual. It is a myth to think that kink is inherently sexual. Go to any dungeon or any kink space, and you'll probably find that there are a good percentage of people there that are asexual. Right? For me, I find the largest gatherings of asexual folks in kink and BDSM spaces, also neurodivergent folks. Right? For many kinksters, kink and BDSM are not sexual activities at all. Right? They might be intimate, they might be erotic, but that's not the same as sexual. Those things can come apart. In fact, for many asexual folks, kink can be a fun and fulfilling alternative to sex. Right? So one of my partnerships that I've had in the past, deeply loving partnership, and we engaged in rope play and various other activities, none of which were conventionally sexual. And it was a really interesting experience because I'm asexual. I didn't experience anything that we did as sexual. I saw it all as pure kink. They did experience it as sexual. And we talked about that. And where we ended up was really fascinating to me. It turned out we just meant very different things by sexual. I experienced it as not sexual because I had a particular understanding of what sex was. If they granted that definition, they would agree that what we were doing wasn't sex. They had a different understanding of what sex is. And under their definition, I would have agreed what we were doing was sex. So we agreed to carry on. We're like, we just talk different. So I didn't describe it as sexual. They did describe it as sexual. We didn't disagree about anything that was happening. We just used different definitions to describe it. And actually, that worked for us. It was fine. But with these myths busted, that kink stems from trauma, that it's just abuse, or that it's inherently sexual, there's more we could bust, but maybe we'll do that in a bit. I want to know, if any of y'all want to open up, what feelings come up for you when you think about your own relationship to sex, intimacy, and kink? Are they positive feelings? Are they challenging feelings? Are they complicated feelings? Because even though I speak about this with enthusiasm and I do it as part of my professional life, I have really complicated feelings about it. in part because of my history, my embedding in communities, etc. But for any of y'all, are you finding it empowering? Do you find it, I see, complicated and challenging, both very negative? I hear so many people report negative experiences with these things. And it's understandable because there are a lot of bad actors out there. And even a lot of folks who think they're acting right, but just don't know, which is why education here is so, so important. See, frustrating, despite understanding, I feel hesitant. That's reasonable, right? Both complicated and empowering. I feel that too. Mm-hmm. Learning and working through a lot of it with my spouse slash dom. Mm-hmm. It can be so powerful to go through this journey with someone too, right? See, breaking free from the old version as my relationship to my body changes is a lot of work. It is, y'all. It is. And speaking to that, when we're going through a physical gender transition, kink can be such a powerful container for doing that exploration because it allows you to rediscover your connection to your body. That said, everyone's journey is different and it can be very, 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 very strenuous, right? I see sharing here. I've had some bad experiences and some of the best experiences. Absolutely, right? And in this, we might think that, this stuff could apply even to vanilla sex as well, right? Some bad experience, maybe some of the best, right? So I really do appreciate y'all sharing. I know this is kind of more vulnerable stuff than some of the topics we often talk about, right? I'll take this one last comment and then go to the next section. It says, kink has been a bit of an anchor for me while transitioning because it's a constant while I feel like so much about my body is changing. Thank you for putting words to that. That's so beautifully put. And I find that deeply relatable, right? I don't think if I had not had that anchor, my transition would have been very foreign to me. It would have not taken the shape that it did, I think. So I want to talk about safety and risk awareness because when you're engaging in stuff outside of the norm, safety and risk awareness are absolutely essential. I mean, even when you're engaging with stuff inside the norm, these things are both absolutely essential, right? But the edgier stuff you do, once you start getting into what kinksters call edge play, which is anything where you're playing on the edge of safety, you need to consider this stuff. Because I know when I first started, I didn't consider it as much as I would have liked to. And then there was a time where I thought I was considering it, but I didn't know what that really looked like. And I ended up putting myself in some pretty risky and pretty dangerous situations, some of which I still bear marks from that I wish I didn't. So, but here's a reminder. It's another quote from Devin Price, who I quoted earlier. This is from his Substack article, There is no safe sex, there is no safe life. Right? Now, Devin here is speaking from the perspective of an autistic, trans-masculine, kinky person. I want you all to keep that in mind as we read this. It says, life is nothing but a negotiation of risk. If a person has gender dysphoria and they want to combat it, they must risk a transition that they could one day regret. If an abolitionist wants to take a stand against the police state, they must plan for the possibility of arrest or political repression. When we open our hearts to love, we expose ourselves to grief. Our partners will keep changing and growing, sometimes away from us. Each step that we take forward in life closes off potential paths. There is no avoiding this. So instead of chasing after the false promise of safety, trying to remain completely insulated from harm and challenge forever, we must get better at admitting risk into our lives. And I find this very comforting, actually. Maybe you do too. Maybe not. That's okay. But if you do, I'm with you. Right? This idea that risk is inevitable, that makes it a little easier for me to approach it, make friends with it, recognize that it's always there, and to stop looking for safety and to start looking for things that are safer. Right? I make that distinction a lot when people ask me why if I moved from Texas to New Mexico, because New Mexico is a safe state for trans people. And I always say, honey, there is no state that's safe for trans people. I just feel a little safer here. Right? But safer doesn't mean safe. So much of sexual health education, those of y'all who are quote unquote fortunate enough to have it, much of it focuses on abstinence and on how not to get pregnant or contract an STI. That's the notion of safety, right? And much of sexual health is about how to not create inconvenience for men. But what often gets left out are the 6 principles of sexual health, which are by sexologist, psychologist Doug Brown Harvey, founder of the Harvey Institute. And here are 3 or 6 things we might foreground when we're wondering whether or not our own sexual health practice is healthy. The first is consent. Is it consensual? And we can break consent down. Is our consent freely given? Is it reversible? Is it informed? Is it specific? Right? Do we feel it with our body? Right? Sexual health is not just consensual, but it's non-exploitative, which isn't to say that there aren't transactions. There can be healthy transactional sex. I'm a dominatrix. There can be healthy transactional intimate exchanges. Mine are non-sexual, but there can be sexual ones too. But we want to make sure that we're aware of the power dynamics in play. Is someone being coerced or exploited? The principles continue. Sexual health is honest. Doesn't involve deceit, right? If we're going to consent, it needs to be informed consent. Informed consent requires honesty, right? Shared values is another one. And this one requires some comment because it's not saying that you have to vote for the same people or have the same religion in order to have healthy sex, right? It's not saying leftists can only have sex with leftists and liberals and conservatives can only have sex with liberals and conservatives. It's not saying that, right? It's saying you want to be on the same page about what the act means, about what it is you're doing, right? About the value placed in the connection that you're building, right? Or you at least want to be informed if there's a difference, an incongruence in those values. Right? The next of the principles is risk awareness, which we gestured at a moment ago. And then the final one, and I'm so glad this one's included, it's pleasure. Now, pleasure can mean a lot of things, right? I'm a masochist. I probably experience pleasure differently than a lot of people listening to this right now, a lot of you here, right? But pleasure is stuff that brings us satisfaction, brings us joy, makes us feel good, even if it makes us feel really bad, right? But it's so important to foreground that because I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of you, when you learned about sexual health in health class, if you were lucky enough to, probably didn't mention pleasure at all. But yeah, healthy sex practice is going to be consensual, non-exploitative, honest, rooted in shared values, risk awareness, and pleasure. Now, that risk awareness, there's been this sort of campaign in kink communities to figure out how to encapsulate that. And a long time ago, they came up with this acronym called SSC. It was a PR move. It was to try to get people outside of kink communities to stop thinking that people in them were abusive. So they started identifying their activities as SSC, as safe, sane, and consensual, right? It's yeah, we're hitting each other, or yeah, we're engaged in domination, or yeah, I'm wearing a puppy mask, but everything we're doing is safe, sane, and consensual. Now that one gets a lot of pushback as the sort of risk awareness slogan bumper sticker. Reason being, saying it's safe is, again, a little misleading. It might give newcomers a false sense of security. A lot of the stuff we do is not safe. And also, calling it sane might be a little ableist because it contrasts with this pejorative notion of insane. I've seen some stuff that it would crack open some minds. I've seen some pretty difficult scenes performed, right? So people have tried to move beyond this notion of SSC, and they might go into this sort of philosophy called RAC, which is risk-aware consensual kink. You explore the erotic non-normative consensually with a discussion of information and risk awareness. Risk awareness is tricky, though, because like I said before, I've been in a position where I thought I was risk aware and I actually wasn't because I just didn't know what to look for. We're not always the best judge of whether or not we're officially or sufficiently risk aware. Another one of these acronyms that sometimes gets used is PRIC. And that stands for personal responsibility, informed, consensual, kink. I forgot the K. This is an attempt to get past that worry about risk awareness and just say, look, you're informed, it's consensual, and if anything goes wrong, you were informed and consenting, so take personal responsibility. If you're doing rope and you get some nerve damage, but you opted into it and you knew that was a possibility, well, as long as no one was being negligent, you got to understand, like, there are things that will happen. Right? It's sort of like you get in a mosh pit. Can't get in a mosh pit and then complain when someone bumps into you. Right? And then the culmination of these, or one of the more recent ones, is crash. Consensual, risk-aware shit happens. It's a recognition that when you're playing with fire, sometimes literally, you will get burned. Any of y'all who have ever done fire play, you know, if you're going to do it, you're eventually going to get hurt. It's just, even if you're practicing the best safety protocols, right? And this is why we do acknowledge this need for safer practices and risk awareness, right? And for a lot of people, it's that risk, though, that adds the attractive edge, that bit of enticement that makes it feel transgressive. Right? It's living on the edge, as it were. So as you're getting started out, even periodically or later, or when you adopt a new partner, or if you're engaging with someone for the first time at a club, like a pickup style thing, you want to make sure to determine your risk profile and talk to any partners about theirs. Right? Think about what risks you are and aren't willing to take. Like for me, I'm not going to get suspended and roped by someone I meet that night. They got to learn me first. I got to learn them. In fact, I'm not going to let someone suspend me and rope until we've been playing together for about 6 months. That's my rule. If someone's not okay with that rule, that's okay. That's on them, but they're outside of my risk profile. Right? When you're setting up your own risk profile, you might ask, what are your soft limits? What are the things that are negotiable, but kind of like a soft no? And what are your hard limits? Things that are absolutely not. Things that are a no, no matter what. What are your safety requirements for a partner? Are you going to require that anyone you do rope bondage with have a pair of safety shears? I suggest that you have that requirement, please. Right? What's your plan if something goes wrong? If you're engaged in needle play and something goes wrong, what is your plan for first aid? What is your plan for medical attention? How are you going to explain any visible marks to your employer? These are all things to think about when determining your risk profile. And it's perfectly okay to have any sort of narrow or broad risk profile. That's up to you. You just want to make sure that it's compatible with the risk profile of the people you're playing with. Right? Don't extend yours just to fit them, and don't force them to extend theirs just to fit you. Right? And really think about these things. If I'm going up to someone who wants to play, and I ask them, what are your limits? And they say, I have no limits. Red flag, right? Major red flag, disqualifying red flag. I will say, you need to take some time and learn yourself, and then we can talk. Or I might just say, okay, cool, I will tie you up. Let me go get my chainsaw out of the car and see how they react. I want to ask, and you can answer here with words, you can answer with a number. How confident are you in your understanding of safety practices and risk assessment? And what would you say are your growth areas? Is it that you struggle with the communication aspect to like make sure that your risk profile corresponds with another person's? Is it that you struggle with sort of figuring out your own limits because like maybe you struggle with self-honesty? What are some of your growth areas in this particular realm, if any of you want to share? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I see that answer, clueless. A growth area there might be figuring out what your growth areas are, right? And that's a perfect place to start. Right? We all start somewhere, right? And figuring out what you're interested in, and then reading up a little bit on it and asking, okay, so if I'm interested in that, what do I need to know in order to do it safely or more safely? Right? And think, okay, so what am I willing to do? Right? What am I not willing to do? Right? So I have a couple friends who are dancers in clubs. They really want to engage in impact play, but they can't because it might leave a bruise and that would affect their income. right? So for them, that one of their growth areas was learning that their job might not permit them to engage in certain things that they would otherwise really like to do. I see a mention here of self-confidence as a growth area. I know what I want, but not how to approach it, or I know how to and just don't. I feel that. I feel that, right? One thing that I've found and some others have found is that maneuvering through kink spaces can really help with self-confidence because a lot of the discussion is explicit and overt. Whereas in vanilla spaces, there are a lot of things left as subtext and a lot of things sort of left unsaid or left assumed. And that can, if you struggle with confidence, that can be really, really difficult. All right. Whereas you go to a dungeon, it's much more normalized to just be like, hey, I see you have some floggers. Are you interested in doing impact today? They might say no, but there's no real harm or shame even in asking. It's very normalized, right? This is, of course, under the assumption that you have a space like that to go to, right? More on that in just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I see this note, a little confident, but lots of room for growth. One thing I'd recommend, even for any of y'all who are seasoned kinksters, be a constant beginner. In Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism, there's this concept of beginner's mind, right? Where we always see the world through the eyes of a beginner. There's a saying by Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki that in the beginner's mind, the possibilities are many, and in the expert's mind, there are few. It's because expertise limits and it jades us, right? See the world through beginner's mind, see kink through beginner's mind with lots of room for growth all the time. It can really, really help, right? See, working through past trauma and separating it from the pleasure I could have, healing damage and replacing it with comfort. You know, I didn't include this in the recommended readings, but for anyone who is struggling with trauma related to touch, there's a workshop or a book I'd recommend called The Wheel of Consent, which was originally innovated by a sex worker, Dr. Betty Martin, to sort of rehabilitate her own relationship to touch after doing work that left her a little bit physically traumatized. She later opened up, she only taught it initially to sex workers, but she later opened it up, and I had an opportunity to study with a student of hers and learn it. And I'll say that as a trans person who has a complicated relationship with touch because I experienced touch as filtered through gender dysphoria, that really helped me. And again, it's called the Wheel of Consent. There's webinars, there's in-person workshops, there's a book, and it's really, really helpful stuff. I'm receiving no compensation for promoting it. It's just I've practiced it and it can really, really help with that trauma. So we'll go into the last section now because we have until 45 and then want to take a quick break and I want to have some time for Q&A. So this last section is about getting creative. And the way I interpret this image here is that those two are plotting about what they're going to do to that third one in the back. They just came up with something great and they're like, ha, 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 ha. Yeah. So a little evil maniacal laugh about whatever creative thing is about to happen. I love telling these little stories about these folks. So my friend Midori, who I mentioned earlier, wrote the first English language book on rope bondage, amazing artist, sexologist, educator, has this quote that BDSM is childhood joyous play with adult sexual privilege and cool toys. It's cops and robbers with fucking, but fucking optional for the asexual folks out there. Right? I love this definition because it's freeing. It's freeing, it acknowledges the complexity, and it acknowledges that the toys are cool. Right? Y'all haven't lived till you've played with a neon wand with a body conductivity unit. Turns you into a human operation board. It's so fun, right? But this idea that it's cops and robbers, you know, it's play. Someone is role playing as a dominant, someone is role playing as a submissive, right? And I see one of the best definitions I've heard, actually the best. If you don't mind, I would love to text that to Midori after this because I think she will be tickled to hear someone say that. So with your permission, I would love to just like send her a text and say, you won't believe what someone said in the webinar. Awesome. Awesome. Cool. And this is very much how I see it, maybe how you'll see it too, right? So this section on getting creative, right? So rather than conforming to the sexual and intimate scripts that dominant society prescribes to us, kink and BDSM give us the space to write our own. And that's why I haven't gone in this webinar into a lot of things like here's how you hold a flogger or here's what pet play is. Because I don't want to just give you a whole bunch of new categories and instructions. Instead, what I'm hoping you'll find is permission to write your own scripts. And you can really get creative. Maybe your kink is sexual. Maybe it's non-sexual. Maybe it's partnered or maybe it's solo. Maybe it's very simple or maybe it's really ritualistic and elaborate. Maybe it's frequent. You do it every day. Maybe it's occasional. You do it once a year. Great. Oh, that's great. Make it your own. Maybe your kink is sitting with your partner and locking your toes together. And maybe for you, that is the peak of intimacy. And maybe you experience that as sex. And maybe you're in a position where you experience bottom dysphoria right now and genital contact is very triggering for you. So you feel cut off from sex. But now that you have permission to rewrite it, you can experience it again on your own terms. That's the freedom we're talking about here, right? It might be that for you, sex is laying there next to a partner, rubbing each other's shoulders with a couple of stuffies between you. That's great. That's great. Or maybe it's something much, much more graphic. That's great too. Let it be yours rather than inherited based on social prescriptions. And an essential step before kink play, whether it's solo or partnered, is negotiation. Getting informed consent among all the parties involved about what's going to happen and what's not going to happen so that you can create this container to freely move within. Right? It's setting it up. It's drawing up a script. It's negotiating the boundaries. This is what we'll do. This is what we won't do. This is what's off limits. This is what's in bounds. Right? You can even use that step not just as part of the creative process, but even as part of flirting or even foreplay. The negotiation might be part of the build up to the scene itself. Sometimes it can be fun to talk to people about what you're going to do to each other, or even what you're not going to do to each other. Right? But you might negotiate a scene where it's just like, look, what we want to do tonight is our scene is going to be extended eye contact with a candle lit between us. And we're going to sit there until that candle goes out. And we're both going to experience this as, or through the lens of sex if we can. Cool. That sounds hot. Maybe that's not your cup of tea. Maybe it doesn't sound hot for you. Negotiate something else. Now, given the way I've been talking about BDSM so far, and again, emphasizing that it can be sexual, but it is not essentially sexual. And instead, it's like this consensual exploration of the erotic non-normative within a negotiated space, within like decided upon boundaries. What would happen if instead of thinking of BDSM as like some weird sex thing, we instead think of it as a game? It's gameplay. It's like playing Monopoly or Twister, but it's a joyous childhood play with adult sexual privilege and cool toys. It's cops and robbers. It's just an occasionally sexified game, but one that's still at its heart a game. I know for me as an asexual person and as an autistic person, reframing BDSM as gameplay made it so much easier to understand why I was into it. Also, keep an eye out. 2026, my book on BDSM as gameplay will be out. I just got to finish writing it. It's taken a minute because the world is hard, but it'll get done one way or another. So I want to know if y'all don't mind sharing in the chat, since I'm really interested in this topic for selfish reasons because of the book, how does that framing of BDSM as gameplay resonate with you? Is it empowering? Is it diminutive? Is it inviting? Is it icky? Right? Keep in mind, it can still be sexual, but it's hard. It's a way of thinking of it as you're playing a game with each other. It's almost like a Dungeons and Dragons. I guess you could even use dice if you wanted to. I see one vote for sounds inviting. Makes it more casual, but in a positive way. Yeah, I mentioned Devin Price twice here, and he has another article about just kind of being more casual about sexuality and intimacy in general, where it's not the greatest thing in the world. It's not the worst thing in the world. It's like going to the bathroom. It's like eating a meal. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's terrible, right? It's neutral, more diverse, empowering. made it make sense as to where I find it so, as to why I find it so interesting. Yeah, I think we can learn a lot when we start reframing it as gameplay about why some of us who are asexual, who are autistic, who carry other identities might gravitate so much toward it. Right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love all these comments in the chat. I appreciate you all. I'm gonna start to wind it down. We'll open it up for a few minutes of Q&A, and then we'll go into the social space. So to recap where we've been, and I feel like we just got started. We could keep talking about this for hours because there's so much to talk about because it is a whole new world, right? We looked at some initial definitions, characterizations of kink and BDSM. We busted a couple of myths that kink is inherently traumatic or related to trauma, that it's inherently abusive, that it's inherently sexual. We looked a little bit at safety and risk awareness, thought about principles of sexual health, learned a couple acronyms that people in the community use, and then we looked at this idea of how to really get creative, how to make it our own, and how to most fundamentally like find that permission to let ourselves make this our own. Right? Let ourselves rediscover what we want sex to be, or what we want play or intimacy or connection or energy exchange or whatever your preferred frame is. What do you want it to be? Right? It can be that. Right? So these are some of those recommended readings. A book by Meg John Barker and Justin Hancock called Enjoy Sex, How, When, and If You Want to, Practical and Inclusive Guide. The book I mentioned earlier with Sprinkles on Top by Stephanie Gorlick. The 2 articles by Devin Price. And I also threw in Juno Roche's Queer Sex, a trans and non-binary guide to intimacy, pleasure, and relationships. So much more to recommend, but that'll get you started. Coming up, we do have other events in March. Public webinars, feminizing bottom surgery. In April, all about binding. We got eligibility for feminizing bottom surgery, masculinizing bottom surgery. And then a couple member exclusive events. In April, we got Trans Got Hands, self-empowerment through striking and movement, Easy Tarot for self-care, feminizing makeup. And I'll have another one next month too on building trans culture and exploring trans art. So I want to say thank you to you all, and we'll go a couple minutes over before starting the social space and take a couple of questions here, and then we'll take about a 5-minute break. So I did get one question in the Q&A, which I'll address quickly. And then if you have any more, y'all, please go ahead. You can't unmute yourself right now just because of the recording. Once we get to the social space, everyone will be able to unmute. But if you do have a question that you want to get answered now during this next couple minutes, just go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. But one of these questions that I got was, how do you find safe places to meet and play with people? And how do you know who to trust? I have a very hard time trusting people a lot of times. It's a really great question. And any of y'all in the chat who want to chime in with suggestions too, please do. Finding safe places to meet. So usually any bigger city will have at least one dungeon in it. Sometimes, depending on where you are, if you're more rural, that might be pretty far away from you. My nearest dungeon is 3 hours away right now. And not all of them are great. There was one 45 minutes from me that shut down because the owner was a very bad man. And I was on staff there. We all quit the whole day. Or we all quit the same day, I should say. It was not good. Really, really did not do a service for anyone in my area trusting people involved in kink, right? So a couple things you can do. I see a mention of FetLife in the chat. FetLife, I recommend cautiously because there's a lot on there, right? What I recommend with FetLife is use it more like Facebook than like OkCupid. Use it to connect with people you meet at events. Use it to keep up with events. Don't use it to find partners. Very risky, very risky. And as trans folks, yeah, we can deal with a lot of stuff on there because it's not very regulated, right? But what you can do is get on there and find like an event. You might find something called a munch, right? And a munch is like a non-kinky gathering of kinky people who meet sometimes discreetly at like a coffee shop or at a bar or at a restaurant. And you might just go and hang out there. And then you can connect with them if you start to feel some kind of connection, even not potentially play. You might just feel like you want to share community with them. You feel safe with them. You might connect on FetLife. And then from there, you can start to build a community. You start to see what other people are liking. You start to see what events other people are going to. And it can really help you broaden your access to spaces, if only by providing knowledge. But like I said, I don't recommend getting on FetLife and going searching for a partner. That can be really, really tricky. And there's a lot of people on there that will not be good to spend time with. It's a difficult space. If you know, you know. But yeah, to tie back in, try to find a munch in your area. And again, a munch is just a gathering of kinky people, typically in a vanilla space, right? And if you can find that, great way to get in. You might also find classes. So like in my area, I live in New Mexico. There's a group up in northern New Mexico called WINK, Women in New Mexico Kink. I've taught with them a couple times. Great place to go and like learn and then also meet some people. Right? Yeah. Now, with the trust thing, finding people to trust is tricky, right? And I would say vet your partners. It is okay, and this might sound tricky or weird for anyone not in the community, but it's okay to ask for references. You can ask for references, right? If I'm taking on a new play partner in a community, I will ask, hey, who else have you played with? And I will ask them, hey, what's your experience playing with this person? That is an okay thing to do. Looked down upon in vanilla culture, in BDSM culture, much more normalized, right? And also, it's important to note if you do get on FetLife, someone being friends with someone on FetLife doesn't mean they'll vouch for them. That all gets really complicated, right? I'll take one more question, then we'll break and then go to the social space. See, my partner and I are interested in going to a BDSM convention, but are worried about how other attendants will act. Is it safe and respectful? So my answer would be, I can't say for sure, but I will say I have felt safer at every BDSM convention I've ever been to than in any vanilla bar that I go to. Because the norms of consent and like at a BDSM convention, no one's gonna touch you without asking, right? Again, I should never say no one because there are bad actors out there, but the norm will be no one will touch you without asking. Whereas you go to a vanilla bar, that can definitely happen, right? So I'll often tell people I feel safer in kink spaces than I do in vanilla spaces because there's much more intention, right? And I think if you're going to a BDSM convention, you'll probably be in even better hands because a lot of those are run like conferences. You'll be going around in a hotel, you'll be going to seminars, there'll be vendors, and there'll also be people monitoring the event. So I think going to a convention is a really, really great place to start. If any of the rest of you on the chat want to chime in to offer any perspective on that, please feel free. Right? Now,